Hey, good morning, church. How you doing out there? Welcome to Sunday. We're so glad that you're here with us. My name is Jeremy. I'm the lead pastor here at Redemption Gilbert. We have a great day ahead of us. It's already started with amazing worship this morning, and we're excited to be in our sermon series in the Sermon on the Mount. We're rapidly approaching the end. We have this week and next Sunday. We'll close out the Sermon on the Mount, which I'm excited to teach through. We have just a few announcements I want to get before you before we get started here. One is a little bit of a retrospective because yesterday was the Tom Schrader Memorial Open. It was a really great event. I know many of you were there and playing golf with us. We had 31 foursomes out there. We sold out the event. It was really great. My wife Rachel hates when I draw attention to her, so I won't, but she may or may not have planned an excellent event that was really great. I was talking about it last night, and I said one of the things that's really interesting is if this event was just what happened yesterday, where a bunch of people from the church got together and had fun together out on a beautiful golf course and made memories, it would be worth doing. But beyond that, we raised nearly $20,000 for the Youth Scholarship Fund to help send kids to camp. It was an incredible win. It's going to invest in the next generation and make sure that the gospel is heard effectively at camps over the next few years. We're really thankful for that. If you weren't there and you think, man, I wish I had done that, then next year is coming. So get ready and sign up next time we come around. I have a few things to announce that are upcoming that you need to know about because we are fully in the swing of holiday season. Here it is. And I'm excited to tell you about Women's Friendsgiving that's coming up on November 20th. This is an amazing opportunity for you to get together with other women here in the church, enjoy food and hanging out, building relationships. You don't want to miss it. These are always great events. The women's leadership team does an incredible job at hosting a really great event for ladies here in our church. So you need to register for it. So you can either point your phone at the code that's on the screen right now, or you can go out to the info desk after the service, or best yet, you can get on the app and there will be a link there that you can follow to register for that event so that they can plan for your attendance. You don't want to miss it. And then the last one is I want to invite you to be a part of our Christmas choir. I don't know if you were here last year for Christmas Eve, but for the first time in as long as I can remember, we actually had a Christmas choir made up of you. And it was really great. One of the things that is so helpful about an event like this, I was at a multi-church conversation in the last week. And we were talking about things that are strengths and weaknesses about our churches and what we're working on. And one of the questions they asked is, what kind of environments do you have where generations come together, both young and old, in one place? And one of the things I actually talked about was the Christmas choir, because we had kids in like 7, 8 years old, all the way up to older than that, and they were all singing together, and it was a really beautiful thing. So if you have a gift of song in your heart and you'd like to share it with us, why don't you sign up to be a part of the Christmas choir? I think Connor told me we still need another 20 or 25 people to join the choir and be a part of it for Christmas Eve services, which are coming up very rapidly. So once again, you can point it at the screen or head to the app or the info desk after service. We're continuing in the Sermon on the Mount. Here we are in chapter 7. The Sermon on the Mount is the most famous teaching of Jesus, a collection of things that he probably taught over many years and delivered in a sermon here by the shores of the Sea of Galilee. They encompass the chapters of 5, 6, and 7 out of the Gospel of Matthew, and we are here right towards the end of chapter 7, heading towards the end of the sermon. So I'm going to lead us in this, as I have been doing up till now, by starting at the beginning of chapter 7 and just reading us up to the portion that we're working on today. Today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 through 20, but I'm going to get us up to there so you can listen, and then the text for today I will put up on the screen once we reach it. Matthew 7 begins this way: "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take out the plank in your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give to dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. And if you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks the door will be opened. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone, or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Now our text for today, starting in verse 13. Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. This is the word of the Lord. Would you join me in praying that God would be with us here this morning? God, we thank you so much for the time that we have to gather together and listen to the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. God, to be able to have the freedom to spend months thinking about, ruminating on, contemplating the words of Jesus in this sermon is such a gift. I pray that this morning we would be able to hear your voice. I pray that this morning we would take up your challenge to deal with the log in our own eye before we go to deal with the speck in others. God, I pray that we hear you challenge us in our presuppositions about the world and about where wisdom is found. I pray that the Spirit would meet us here and transform us even this morning more into the likeness of Jesus who we love. We pray this in his name. Amen. My family and I love to road trip. So since the boys have gotten old enough, we've been doing summer road trips around the country, and the theme of those road trips has largely been national parks. And we've seen many of the national parks around the western part of the United States. There is one glaring and obvious hole in our planning, and it is southern Utah. There are 5 national parks in southern Utah. We, at this point, have only seen one of them, Bryce Canyon. And I think mostly because our summer breaks usually don't line up with really hot southern Utah weather, and so we've avoided them at this point. But beyond even the 5 national parks, there are things there that I want to see that don't even fall within national parks, like this place. It's Spooky Gulch. And this is in the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in southern Utah, just north of Page, Arizona. There's a place in Spooky Gulch called Peekaboo Slot Canyon. Any Peekaboo Slot Canyon visitors? Can see how popular it is. One guy over here. Thank you, Barry. I appreciate your participation. Peekaboo Slot Canyon is actually maybe the subconscious reason that we've never visited southern Utah. Because I don't know if you know what Peekaboo Slot Canyon looks like, but for your benefit, I have a picture for you. It looks like this. I don't know if you can see that guy. But it is an extremely narrow slot canyon, and you have to get through this spot that has been a massive problem for the Park Service over many years because people repeatedly will go into this canyon and get themselves wedged in the narrow part of the slot canyon and have to be rescued. In fact, it has become such a repeated problem that one of the ways they have determined to solve it is they have put a sign in the parking lot outside of the gulch that warns you about this and gives you a way to measure whether it's going to be okay for you. In fact, here's what it looks like. It says, warning, Spooky Slot Canyon, extremely narrow. And then you can't actually read it, but here I'll get close so I can read it. It says, if you have trouble fitting your body between these 2 posts, do not proceed into the canyon. And actually, if I'm being really honest, I think subconsciously this is the reason I don't want to go. Because in my nightmares, we've driven all the way there. There's a line of people waiting their turn, and I go, and this big wide load does not fit through the slot canyon test. It sounds terrifying to me to get stuck in a slot canyon. It is a very narrow place. And when we talk about narrow places, people tend to get uncomfortable, including me, and yet Jesus says that the path to life is an exceedingly narrow gate. That's what his text says as he opens this part of the sermon. He says, enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate And broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it, but small is the gate, and narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. I had the blessing and privilege to grow up in the church. My family, as long as I remembered, was a Christian family, and my mom and dad would take me to church every single Sunday. I remember following Jesus in my innocent 5 or 6-year-old faith by praying a prayer that Jesus would come to live in my heart when it was in my bedroom with my mom as a little boy. I remember that. And this text, if you've been around the church at all, is probably a fairly common one. Maybe if you even haven't been around the church, you've heard this text. And I was very familiar with it as a kid, and I knew how it worked. Because narrow was the gate and narrow was the road that me and my friends and our church was on, and wide was the road that everybody else was on, especially people who didn't follow Jesus. They were over there on the wide road because it was easy, but we were here on the narrow road that led to salvation. And that seems to make sense. You go, wait, isn't that what it is actually saying? Here's the issue that we're going to wrestle with today that we have to deal with. Jesus was not giving this sermon to a mixed audience of people who were faithful followers of God and people who wanted nothing to do with him. You need to remember who the audience is he's preaching to. Before him are faithful Jews, both poor and rich, both insignificant and significant. But every single one of them, I would guess, to a person would have said, I believe in Yahweh, the God of Israel. I trust in him. My life is organized around him. I know his word. I'm attempting to follow it. I want to be faithful. And it's that audience that he says, narrow is the gate and narrow is the road, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many are on it. To the audience that heard this, they would have been shocked by what he was saying. Because what he's saying is there are many of you here who are listening today who think that you're on the road that leads to salvation, and you might be on the road that's leading to destruction. In fact, our last sermon that we will do next week, just to give you a preview, says that at the end, when God judges, many people will stand before him and say, didn't I do what you asked me to do? And he will say, I didn't know you. And so if your tendency, like mine, especially when I was younger, is to say, oh, I know who the narrow and the wide applies to. The narrow is us and the good Jesus people, and the wide is those people out there who don't want anything to do with him and they say bad things about Jesus. You're going to miss the point that Jesus is really trying to bring. There's a reason that this section follows the speck and the log. Because he's saying to you today, right now in this room, are you going to be willing to examine the log in your own eye? Are you going to be willing to not start looking out there to figure out who's on the broad path? Instead, say to yourself, wait, am I on the narrow path? Is my life one that is leading to life? That's what he's going to wrestle with here. And this idea of two ways, a broad and a narrow way, is all over the Old Testament scriptures. This was a common way of thinking in ancient Jewish thought. Jesus would have grown up knowing the scriptures that talk this way. In fact, my first draft of this sermon had about 6 or 7 different texts throughout the Old Testament that reference this being on the way. And for your benefit, I whittled it down to 2. So we have 2 of them up here today that will draw your attention. One is old and one is newer in the sense of ancient Israel. One comes from the book of Deuteronomy. And Moses is giving the people of Israel instruction on what it looks like to follow him faithfully, and he says this: the path of the righteous is like the morning sun, shining ever brighter until the full light of day. But the way of the wicked is in deep darkness. They don't know what makes them stumble. Give careful thought to the paths for your feet and the steadfastness in your ways. Moses was saying, Israel, here's the way it works. If you're on the righteous path, the narrow gate, your life will be one of blessing and goodness, even though it appears narrow from the outside. But most of the world is walking in darkness, and they trip and they stumble over things, and because it's dark, they can't even identify what are the things in my path that I'm tripping over. And if you can't see it, you can't avoid it. And we're going to talk about how that leads into this idea of prophets here in a minute. Jeremiah, the prophet, later in the life of Israel, writes on behalf of God, and he says this, "Thus says the Lord, stand by the roads and look, and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is, and walk in it, and find rest for your souls." And then he answers on behalf of Israel because they said, "We will not walk in it." Jesus is talking to an audience of people who say, we are God's people. We have been chosen by him. We are on mission. We are his favorites. And when the instruction comes to those people to look for the ancient ways of God, to be faithful and close to him, they say in their hearts, we will not. And when Jesus says the road is narrow and the way is broad, we have to stop and think and ask ourselves questions. Which road are we on? Which path are we walking? And are we saying in our lives, we won't walk in that way? Growing up, Disney movies were something that I was allowed to watch. There were many things that were off limits, but Disney movies were generally fair game, and Pinocchio was a favorite. I don't know if you've had a chance, especially if you're younger, to go back and watch Pinocchio. It's a classic Disney movie. But in the movie, there is a very odd sequence when you go back and watch it, in which Pinocchio and his conscience, Jiminy Cricket, are enticed by a character by the name of Honest John. And Honest John says, "Pinocchio, I've got the plan for you." And here's what he tells him. "Perhaps you haven't heard of the easy road to success. It's to be in the theater and to be famous and to build a name for yourself. And in fact, you can go perform and go to a place called Pleasure Island where everything that you want and desire can be yours. Candy galore, rides and entertainment." And then later on, Honest John is at the bar with his buddies laughing about what he has pulled over on Pinocchio, and he says it this way, "And the dummy fell for it. Hook, line, and sinker." And he still thinks that we're his friends. I think the reality is that there are voices in our lives, voices in our culture, voices that call themselves religious good people, voices that say they are righteous warriors for what is right in the world, that in their dark, smoky room at the end of the day sit with their buddies and they laugh and they say, "Can you believe those dummies fell for it? They fell for it hook, line, and sinker." And they still think we're their friends. Whew, that's heavy. That's a little scary. That's cause for introspection. I'm going to actually back up before I get to that. This last week, Rachel knew I was prepping for the sermon, and Tim Keller is a pastor who pastored a church called Redeemer in New York City for many years, and he died just a couple of years ago. He's been very influential in my life, very influential in the life of my wife, and she went and listened to a sermon by him on this topic and sent it to me. And she said, "I don't know if you have time to listen to this, but I found it really helpful. You should check it out." And so I listened to it. I usually take her advice. And he had a quote in that sermon that I thought was really great. And this is what he says. "It is socially acceptable to say that you're searching for God, but it's socially unacceptable to say you found God." Why? Because finding is narrow. Right? We live in a world that is very comfortable with you being on some search for meaning in life. I want to find deeper things. I want to find where I can find a real path of meaningful production in my life. I want to find something that connects me to a higher power. I want to find something that gives me a real purpose with what I'm doing. We love that kind of talk, but what we don't want to hear about is when you found it, because if you found it, that challenges the idea that there is real truth out there. Because when we say, "And I found it," I went searching for God and I found him, he's found in the person of Jesus Christ, suddenly you're talking about something very narrow. And what the world does not want is to have their options limited and be forced into one question. But here we are. Jesus says that the way to life, the gate to find the narrow road that leads to life, is a narrow one. It's small, And if you're carrying anything with you, you're probably not going to fit through. If you say, I want to find the way to life, just let me bring with me my ego, just let me bring my plans, just let me bring my money, my reputation, just let me bring my career, just let me bring my charisma and good looks, just me, you're not going to fit. Because it doesn't work that way. And then he pivots and he begins to talk to something that seems maybe vaguely like it's disconnected from this idea of the gate and the road. He says, you have to watch out for false prophets because they're going to come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ferocious wolves. This is an analogy that would have been very common in Jesus' day because many of the people that lived, particularly in the area Jesus was teaching, were farmers and shepherds. And the way that you made your living was your flock and your sheep, and the way that you would protect them is to watch out for dangers that were out there. King David famously would fight bears and lions with his bare hands, protecting his sheep. You don't have to be exactly a genius. None of you, I'm assuming, have deep training in shepherding, but you could probably pick out the difference between a bear or a wolf and a sheep. Even with very little training, you can figure it out. Wait a second, that don't look like a sheep. I need to do something about that. And Jesus says, here's the problem. False prophets will come and they're going to wear a disguise. And the disguise is a sheep's disguise. They're going to be right there in the flock amongst the sheep. And you're going to think it's okay to let them in and to participate alongside them. But inwardly, they're wolves who can't wait for you to turn your back and devour the sheep. This idea of the gate and prophets is actually another one that's very common in Israel's language that they would have grown up with. The scriptures Jesus quoted all the time were talking about this because an ancient city had a protective wall around it, and in the wall was a gate that would lead to the road that led out to the world. And what would happen at the gate is the elders and the wise people of the city would sit at the gate. In fact, I put Proverbs 23 up here. That's actually it's mistyped. It's Proverbs 31. Actually, this Proverbs 31 is the final book or chapter in the book of Proverbs, and it tells the story of a virtuous woman. And in her story, there's one line about her husband, and this is what it says about her husband. Her husband is respected at the city gate, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. She's a virtuous woman doing a lot of amazing things, and it just as a side mentions, and her husband is a man of respect. How do you know? Because he sits at the gate with the other elders, and he dispenses wisdom and direction and warning. He's the guy who knows what's going on. Hey, is there any danger out there today? Is there anything I need to be looking out for? You went and talked to the elders who sat at the gate. One of my favorite chapters in the entire Bible is Job chapter 29. I'm sure it's yours too. We don't go to Job very often. Job is famously the story of a man who had everything. He was wealthy, he had kids, he had heirs, he had land, he had all the things that he needed, and then Satan sifts him. He loses everything because Satan says, God, if he loses everything, he's not going to follow you. He's only following you because life is good and easy for him. And Job, after he's lost everything, he's thinking wistfully back on the days when things were good for him. In Joel 27, he says this is part of what it looked like, or Job 27, this is what it looks like. When I went to the gate of the city and I took my seat in the public square, the young men saw me and they stepped aside, and the old men rose to their feet. It was a place of respect and honor where the prophets of your culture would sit and you could go consult with them. And then Jesus says the problem is that many times the prophets want you to think that they're sheep and they're one of you, but they're actually wolves hiding amongst the sheep. Now, I don't know where your city gate is, but I have a guess because I think we all kind of have the same city gate. It's this thing that's in your pocket. Mark Sayers, who's a pastor in Melbourne, Australia, he wrote a book called A Non-Anxious Presence. Our staff went through it together. He says it this way: in the networked world, even the most committed believer will consume only a fraction of the information and input from their church compared to what they consume via podcasts, YouTube, and Netflix, and Mike Tyson fights. The digital network is now our primary formational environment. It shapes our opinions, our values, and our worldview. Now, you might say, well, I don't know about me. No, you too. We are shaped overwhelmingly by the digital voices that fill our lives. And one of the things that makes that very difficult is that it is hard to validate the lives of people who are remote from you. I mean, one of the things about social media that makes it so powerful is the version of you that gets promoted out to other people is one that you have carefully curated. You take a selfie, you look close, I look fat, I'm making a stupid face, let's take another one. And then I'll put a filter on it, especially a beauty filter, because I need those, right? The prophets at our gates come to you in the guise of friendly, helpful gurus and advisors that talk to you through podcasts and YouTube subscriptions and streaming media and Instagram influencers and TikTokers doing dances or whatever they do on TikTok these days. It's just the reality. There's a great quote about wolves. This is what it said: "Wolves don't lose their sleep over the opinion of sheep, but they will dress like one to get inside the fold." This is the trick. They have figured out those who speak, and I want to be clear, I'm talking about religious voices and those who are not religious. They all couldn't give two cares about what you think, but they do want your attention. And they want to get close. And we have to be careful. That's what Jesus says. You have to be warned that this is the reality. But he says, there's a way to do it. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? You might say, I actually don't know where grapes or figs come from. This is a rhetorical question. It comes with an obvious no. Grapes don't come from thorn bushes. Figs don't come from thistles. But you need to examine fruit. I love the outdoors. And there is a delicacy in the outdoors. It's called the morel mushroom. Morel? Either one. It's a mushroom. That's what it looks like. There's a quote about it. It says, the morel is the prize of the spring woods, a delicacy for those lucky enough to find it, and a treasure for those who know its secrets. If you're a forager who goes out in the woods and picks mushrooms, this is like the creme de la creme. This is the one you're looking for. You want to find a patch of morel mushrooms because they're rare and they are supposedly delicious, and you fry them up with a little butter and a little seasoning, and man, you got yourself a little stew going. You can't even believe how good this thing is. Now, there's a problem. First of all, you say, I live in the desert. I don't ever see mushrooms. Yes, you can find these mushrooms in northern Arizona in the pine forests. There's actually a bigger problem than where do I find them. The problem is this: there's another mushroom called a false morel that looks exactly like that one. And that one is not so delicious. It actually will cause liver failure and kill you. So you have two options. Either you get really good at identifying which one is which, or you just avoid all the mushrooms altogether, which is the thing that I choose. But I did a little research to find out, how hard is it to actually tell the difference between the good one and the bad one? From a distance, and even from picking it, they look almost identical. And it would be hard to tell which one is which. But if you know what to look for, it's really pretty easy. Now, I'm going to tell you the key, and I swear, if any of you goes out there and gets liver failure and dies, it is not my fault, okay? But this is what the experts tell me. Full disclosure. It's actually easy to tell them apart. You just cut them in half, top to bottom. You slide it in half and you open it up. Because the real one is hollow inside. The stem is hollow, the little weird cap is hollow. But the one that is dangerous and the one that will kill you when you open it up is actually filled all the way inside. They say if it looks like a marshmallow inside, don't eat it. So although they look from the outside like they are the same, one is deadly and one is a delicacy, and you have to know what you're looking for, and you have to dig deep to figure out which one is which. And that's the situation that we face as we listen to the prophets at our gates. We have to measure, because to test your prophets, you have to examine what they produce. Every one of us has voices we listen to. Every one of us has a litany of people who are speaking into our life week by week. And the advent of the subscription has made those voices repeated voices. There are podcasts you listen to every week. There's YouTubers you subscribe to. There's folks on social media you follow. You're getting repeated voices. The algorithm has learned if you click on something, you must like that thing, so we're going to feed you more of that thing. You will have a self-replicating voice in your life all the time. Are you testing those voices? Are you asking questions about what you're hearing from them? Because this is what Jesus says about it. Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, bad trees bear bad fruit. Good trees can't give you bad fruit, and bad trees can't give you good fruit. And here's what's going to happen. The tree that doesn't bear good fruit, it's going to get cut down and thrown into the fire. So therefore, the way you figure it out is you check out their fruit. Probably 18 months ago, maybe 2 years ago, in our backyard, we built a little wine arbor. I call it that because that sounds really romantic. It's actually a little thing of wood that has some grapevines under it. And this last year, for the very first time, we had these beautiful grapes grew on the vines. And they were small, and I thought, I bet they're not going to taste very good. And we plucked them off, and we brought them inside. They were amazing. They were sweet. They were delicious. They were wonderful. And then very quickly afterwards, we got infected with spider mites. Spider mites covered the vines with spider mite stuff, and it's gross, and they did not look like they were doing well, and we're doing research. How do we fix this? And we sprayed them with all kinds of stuff to try to rescue them, and they started wilting, and so we said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We got to trim them back very harshly. So what you see now in our backyard is this beautiful little tiny arbor that I built and 3 sticks coming out of the ground. And my wife has concluded that these things aren't probably going to make it, and I'd hate to say she's right, but I keep saying, no, we have to wait for the spring. We have to wait to see when the season turns and the sun comes back out, maybe they'll come back. I actually suspect that we've got just sticks in our backyard now. And you know what's going to happen when we determine that these things are not producing fruit anymore? We're going to dig them out of the ground and put in new ones, because if you are in the business of producing edible fruit, you don't take time to grow things that grow bad fruit or don't grow at all. And that's what Jesus says. There's lots of prophets selling lots of things in the world right now. And some of the fruit that they're producing is bad fruit. And don't worry, someday those things are going to be trimmed and thrown in the fire. So what do we do? And how do we figure out? How do we test the voices we listen to? Well, as we close here, I have two angles I want to come at. The first one is we obviously have to test, are the voices we're listening to and the things they're telling us, are they true things? Now here's the trick about understanding if something is true. You have to know truth to measure if something is true. Lots of convincing voices can say a lot of things, but if you're going to measure whether it's true or not, you have to have a handle on what is true. So I'm going to give you 4 things you should be listening to in the lives or the voices of the prophets you're listening to. Here's the first one. Are they telling the right story? That song we sang right before our worship here is a song that Connor wrote. It's on the Sandcastle Kingdoms EP that they just put out. It's called Allegiance. And it says that he's writing a story with all of history. And then there's good lyrics that follow that I can't remember right now. But it's this idea that what's happening in the world is God is writing a story in which Jesus will set everything right. The problem is that is not a story that many voices are telling. In fact, many of the stories that we hear in our world say things like this: out of chaos and disorder and no direction, we as humanity have gathered ourselves together and we have ordered our lives in a way that has made us better, and we're heading for a bright future where we can all be prosperous and educated and have everything that we need. We can be wealthy and we can be free. That's the story that we're all being told. And I got to be honest, that sounds like a pretty good story. I would sign up for that. That's the problem, is that the story that the Bible tells is very different. God made humanity with purpose that we have thwarted out of our disobedience and our rebellion. That's the story that the Bible tells. It tells us of a God who's still committed to the mission of us living in the way he's called us to, and he has called us out of the nations to follow his son Jesus in his life, death, and resurrections, to be a new kind of people who then bear witness to the reality of the world that eventually will come to full fruition when Jesus returns and sets all things right. That's the real story of the world. The problem is, many of the times the stories we listen to our prophets don't tell that story. They're telling a very different one. The second thing we need to be listening to is, are they getting what is broken in the world right? The greatest temptation that we have as humans is to gather up with our little tribe and say, we're the ones who get it, we're the good ones, they're the problem. And it doesn't matter which tribe you're in, we all do it. We all convince ourselves that the thing that we do and the way we do it is the right and wise way, and the real problem is those people. The real problem is people who don't value education. The real problem is the people who are holding down economic progress. The real problem is the people who stand in the way of scientific advancement. The real problem is the people who want to repress you and your expression of yourself. That's the real problem. Here's the issue with that. That's not the story that the Bible tells. The Bible tells a story that the real problem is you. The real problem is me. The real problem is us who refuse to understand that in our own rebellion against God, we don't follow what we were made to be. That's why Jesus says, you're so worried about the speck in their eye, are you looking at the log in your own eye? The next thing we have to deal with, are they getting hope right? What are you being sold that the hope of the world is? Is it that your investments will continue to rise? Is it the fact that your family will be healthy and free? Is your hope found that the right election outcome will come? Is your hope found in the fact that people will either be educated into the right ideas or be broken from the spell of the bad ideas? Where is the hope of things being set right being found? Because there's a lot of hope being peddled out there. Is the hope that you're being sold in the only place that hope can be found, at the foot of the cross of Jesus? And the last one is really this: are they pointing you to the right gate? Keller got at it in his quote that I read earlier. It's really popular. I hear from people all the time to say, you know what, I'm a spiritual person. I don't like organized religion, but I'm spiritual. What that kind of means is, like, it's hard to ignore that there's a part of me beyond just the physical, but I really don't want to be in for, like, community. And I really don't want any authority telling me that I'm wrong. And I really don't want to submit my life to anyone else. You'll hear people say all the time, hey, listen, it's just all a path. As long as you're a good-hearted person seeking, those are all just paths and gates that lead to the same God. And I go, here's the problem with that. Jesus said something very different. He said all those gates and paths that are leading to somewhere, they are leading to the same place. It's called destruction. Oof. He's saying, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. He says, no one comes to the Father but through him. That's narrow. That's like a slot canyon that a fatso like me can barely slide through. And I understand why there's hesitancy to say, I don't know, is that really the only way? I'm a good person. I try hard. I love my neighbors. I'd like to be measured by that measure. Jesus says, be careful what you want to be used as the measure, because I'm not sure you can live up to it. But all that stuff just gets to the truth. Are they saying the true thing? And you might go, man, that's hard to suss out. You're absolutely right. There's a shortcut, and I love shortcuts, so I can't wait to give it to you. Here's the actual issue. The test isn't ultimately what they teach, but what they create. And if you were going to say, well, how do I figure out what they're creating? I would point you to Galatians chapter 5, when the Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Galatia, and he says, here's how you know. You look at their fruit. Turns out Paul was a great disciple of Jesus, and he knew this teaching, and he said, here's what it looks like. There's two kinds of fruit. There's fruit that comes from the Spirit, and there's fruit that comes from the flesh. And he says, here's what the fruit of the flesh looks like. It looks like this: hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy. He says, I know how to look at the voices. I know what to measure. Here's what their fruit looks like. We talk about the mushroom and you cut it in half. It's helpful to know what the bad fruit looks like. It looks like a marshmallow inside. That's what I'm supposed to be looking for. If I see that, avoid it. Paul gives us the same shortcut. He says, here's what you need to look for. Hatred, discord, jealousy, rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy. I listen to people lament all the time the state of our culture right now. I say it and I hear it from people. Man, our culture is so divided. Man, I feel like people are so hostile. Everybody's like on a knife's edge. Everybody's ready to fight at the drop of a hat. Everybody's in a tribe. Everybody's at war. Yeah, that's the fruit of the Spirit. Are the voices that you're listening to inviting you into this kind of world alongside them? Are the prophets in your world encouraging you to hate others, to have discord in your community, to be jealous of others, to be angry, to pursue your own selfish ambition, to divide, to reorder ourselves into factions, to envy one another? I think so. On the other side, he says, and here's how you know what good fruit looks like. It's called the fruit of the Spirit. It looks like this. It looks like love. It looks like joy. It looks like forbearance, which is a long fancy word for patience. It looks like kindness. It looks like goodness. It looks like faithfulness. It looks like gentleness. It looks like self-control. Here's the problem. If you're in a war with someone who's using the tools of the fruit of the flesh, you're going to get your butt kicked. Jesus came into the world and he sowed the fruit of the Spirit. He brought these things to the world and he was killed for it. So if your argument is, man, I don't know, that doesn't sound like a recipe for winning, I go, yeah, if the battle is to win what everyone else is fighting over, you're right, they'll probably beat you. The tools of the dragon are immensely powerful. The problem is the life, death, and especially the resurrection of Jesus declare that those tools will ultimately fail, and real life is found when we follow Jesus on the narrow path that leads to this kind of life. And so listen. Ask someone you trust. Do the things that the voices I'm listening to and that come out of me sound like this list or this list? Where are the places that I chase that and not that? I don't want to judge your list because that's your spec. But I want to deal with mine because I got a big old log in my eye that I desperately want to deal with because that's what faithfulness looks like. Here's the question we just need to wrestle with as we close this up. Which gate have you chosen and which path will you choose? The first one is this. If you're here and you are a Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus, then at some point in your life you have said, I'm choosing and putting my faith in this gate. But I know there are people in the room today who have never wrestled with following Jesus, who have never followed him through that gate. If that describes you, the invitation to the gate that leads to life is standing right before you right now. What an incredible opportunity to find hope in life. The second one is this. As a Christian, if you're a person who says, yeah, I went through that narrow gate. I shed myself of everything to submit myself to Jesus because he is the only way. I believe it. I affirm it. I will follow it. The problem is that you have a choice to make every single day of your life. Which one of the paths are you going to choose? Because it's tempting, even as followers of Jesus, to take the easy path, the broad path, the one that leads to destruction, to walk off the path and serve myself, to fall into the trap of envy and strife and anger and hatred. You're going to be forced to ask that question, wrestle with that question today. Maybe even before you leave this place, when somebody says, where do you want to go to lunch? It's a question that you were wrestling with every single day. Faith is found in Jesus and Jesus alone, and the life that we are promised, one of blessing and fulfillment, is found when we walk in the ancient ways of wisdom given to us by him. Let's pray that God would help us do that. God, we thank you so much for the Sermon on the Mount. I thank you for the gift of this text. Thank you for the gift of these words. I confess the challenge that they bring to my life. Places where my anger, where my rage, where my self-fulfillment come to the surface. God, forgive us. God, forgive me. God, I pray that we would be a people transformed. I pray that we would be a people of hope. God, I pray that we would be a people that draw others to the narrow gate, because what a good gate it is. God, I pray that we would help each other to walk the narrow path, the path of wisdom, the path that leads to life in you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.